I have seen the torch of freedom pass from hand to yearning hand, and the vision of our fathers spread hope throughout this land, as the dream some fought and died for in my heart becomes my own. I will strive to keep her promise, America, my home. America, America, may God bless America, and freedom reign across America, my home. From the shorelines to the prairies, to the cities great and small, we have reaped the fruits of justice and liberty for all.
So with deep appreciation for the blessings of freedom that we know in this great land of ours, I'm Dr. George Simon, welcoming you to another edition of Character Matters. This is the show where we talk about what I consider to be the defining issue of our time, the character crisis that plagues much of the world today and which jeopardizes all of our freedoms. And for the benefit of you folks who may be new to the program, that is the reason why this patriotic-themed song opens and closes every broadcast. The message of this song that both my wife and I co-wrote and has become popular on the internet and at performance venues across the country, thanks to listeners and performers everywhere. The message is that our freedoms are a gift that we have to treasure personally and that we have to honor by living up to our best ideals. Freedom and character go hand in hand. This country is great, and freedoms are preserved when we are people of good character. When people of good character are left alone, their government leaves them alone. They are free, therefore, to prosper and to pursue their dreams, and they end up doing good not only for themselves, but for the benefit of all. And that's how it's supposed to work, and that is how it has worked in some of our times when we have stepped up to the plate and been of the character that we can be. There have also been, unfortunately, times when we didn't measure up very well. And in those times, our freedoms are always threatened because governments always tend to want to basically legislate morality. They always tend to want to write more rules into law that will restrict our freedoms to try and make us behave. And in fact, there is no law on earth that can keep us safe. You know, a great person said this very thing many hundreds of years ago, almost 2,000 years ago, a little over 2,000 years ago, was saying this same thing, that the rules were meant for man's benefit. And just observing outwardly some of the rules wasn't going to really save us. Because what really plagues us is the evils within our hearts. It's there we have to reckon. And when we're of a clean heart, when we're of a pure heart, when our intentions are noble and pure, we don't really need the rules to guide us. As a matter of fact, if our intentions are noble, and if our motivations are good, actually sidestepping or even not observing a particular rule may be in the greater self-interest and maybe in the greater good's interest. So it's not about the rules. Never has been. But governments always try to restrict our freedoms in an effort to try and make us behave. And it never works. People of unsavory character always find a way around the rules, or they simply don't pay attention to them. The rules depend on good people's compliance. That's what they depend on. You can write all the rules into law you want. So that's why this program begins and ends with a song that seems like strictly a patriotic piece. It's more than that. It's a call to preserving freedom and for each one of us to do our part. It calls for us to honor our heritage and to honor our best ideals. It's a personal appeal. Each one of us has that duty. And it's been my professional mission for the last 30 plus years to write about, to speak about, and to advocate in every way I know how those things that I have come to learn from my practice as a professional therapist for all these years, those things that foster good character. Because what we have, unfortunately, plaguing much of the world is a character crisis, the likes of which we have not seen for a while. And our problems are different. The folks that, quote unquote, need therapy are unfortunately folks for whom most forms of therapy were never really designed. And as a result, most folks in either rehab programs or in therapy venues of one type or another are struggling really, bottom line, with issues of character, of poor character development. And we can turn that around. We can stem that tide, excuse me. And in that regard, I've written some books, and I write for my own and various other blogs. And I invite you to avail yourself of them. In Sheep's Clothing, the international bestseller about understanding and dealing with manipulative people, the definitive work on manipulation by many accounts. And also my other bestseller, Character Disturbance, The Phenomenon of Our Age. This is an in-depth study of the character crisis we face, what's underneath it, what we have to do about it, and most especially what you need to look for in the way of getting help when you're dealing with it. And lastly, my book for the Christian faith community, The Judas Syndrome, about the power of faith to truly save and transform a life, to elevate it to a higher plane. And it's my great fortune to have a good deal of public support for these written works. When I was in school, being trained, I was often given the message that I would likely not be a writer because I didn't seem to have the skills. And I never ever thought that I would end up writing any books. But I began to observe some things in my practice as a therapist, and I just felt a compelling urge to write about them. So I did, and the rest, shall we say, is history. I'm glad that I did. I'm so grateful for the response from the public. And I'm grateful to you, my radio audience. This is a relatively new venture for me, but it's proven to be a wonderful vehicle for getting the message out and for good dialogue. And for those who want to join the conversation today, the number to call is 718-717-8296. That's 718-717-8296. If you want to join in conversation today, we are going to have, once again, an open forum tonight. I do have a couple of things that I want to talk about with regard to the posts that I have on the two blog sites that I write primarily for. My own blog at www.manipulative-people.com. Growing by leaps and bounds. It's gotten to be a really popular blog site. We now have subscribers in the thousands, which is just absolutely remarkable. And I couldn't be happier. I mean, for me to know, or for me to even be told that anyone has overcome a problem relationship or empowered themselves and gotten a new lease on life because of the material advanced either in my books or on my blog, frankly, there is absolutely nothing more edifying. And I also write for another blog based in the UK that has a wide readership also, and it's at www.counselingresource.com, and that's counseling with two L's, no space between counseling and resource, www.counselingresource.com. And I write for both blogs, one article a week, and also contribute to a few other pieces from time to time. One of those being the Dame magazine. Dame magazine is a magazine published on the West Coast. It is a online magazine of interest to women, and I was interviewed for an article in that magazine by Carrie Borzillo, and it's a great article on gaslighting, and that's also the topic of my blog post on manipulative-people.com this week. But Carrie's article in the magazine is "My husband convinced me that I was insane," and this article describes gaslighting, the manipulation technique that I talk about in my books and articles. Gaslighting is a term that's borrowed from the stage play and a movie of the same name. The movie, I think, featured Charles Boyer, a young Charles Boyer, and a very young Ingrid Bergman. The play and the movie are about a husband, a no-goodnik, who wants to get rid of his wife and wants to do so by convincing her that she has lost her mind, and how he does, part of the way of how he does that is to slowly and incrementally change the settings on a gas lamp that's in their home. And she, the wife, in thinking that it's dimming and others do not think that it is, partly begins to believe that she is going crazy. But that's just one of the things that the husband does to convince the wife she's going crazy. And so at any rate, the term gaslighting is borrowed from that play and from that movie. to describe any manipulation technique that is basically designed to make you feel like you're nuts. And this is something that I say that covertly aggressive characters use as a technique of manipulation. And they can do it in a number of ways. You can be gaslighted in a number of ways. Part of the way that gaslighters gaslight is just by insisting on something with such an intensity or ferocity or with such apparent conviction that they make you doubt instantly because of how convicted they seem. Or they feign outrage. Serial cheaters, by the way, are notorious for using this technique. You know, you begin to suspect that your partner is cheating. All the evidence is there. And so you're gradually losing trust, and you've got your suspicions, and you try to confront. But as soon as you do, you get this kind of, what are you, crazy kind of attitude, excuse me, from them. And it's not so much what they say, but how they say it, or how they look. They may look indignant, outraged, that you would dare suspect such a thing. How dare you? What are you, crazy? Or they may make some false gestures to offer you proof, offer to show you email records, offer to show you text message diary on the smartphone, or whatever the case may be. Anything to prove to you that you have no business thinking what you're thinking, that you're just out of your mind for mistrusting. And then, of course, you cave, you buy into their malarkey, and you stay victimized for as long as they want you to stay victimized. That's how the technique works. Make the other person feel crazy, make them doubt, and then you've got one leg up. And that's what all manipulation techniques are designed to do. Basically, to give the abusive party a leg up, to give them a position of advantage within a relationship. That's what it's all about. So that's the term. That's where it comes from. That's what it means. And actually, if you go online to damemagazine.com, you'll find that article in the recent edition by Carrie Borzillo. Title of the article again is "My Husband Convinced Me I Was Insane." Actually, Ms. Borzillo writes from personal experience in the article. She didn't even know what gaslighting was until she experienced it firsthand, she says in the article. There's also some interesting things in the article that I want to talk about, but I want to once again invite you, if you've been the victim of gaslighting, if you want to know more about it, if you have a story to tell, something you want to share, a question to ask, you want to join the conversation in any way, once again, the number to call is 718-717-8296. That's 718-717-8296. I'm happy to take your call, and we'll talk about gaslighting or whatever else you want to talk about. But I did want to, I was not the only expert consulted with for this article in Dame Magazine, which by the way, I posted an excerpt from it and talked about it on my weekly post at manipulative-people.com. So you can go to my blog site there at www.manipulative-people.com and read the article with a link to the article in Dame Magazine. But you'll also find more information, and also in my article on manipulative-people.com, you'll find links to several other articles that I've written on the topic of gaslighting, and also references to the places in my books where I talk about this and other manipulation techniques. But what I wanted to say is that in this article in Dame Magazine, true to form, other experts, of course, were consulted, and one of the experts consulted uh, gave pretty much what I call the standard party line from therapist types. Uh, I myself am a renegade and radical therapist. I'm confessing that to you right now. Many therapists do not share my views. More and more are, I'm proud to say. I'm happy to say. When I first started uh, in the field, and when I first started writing, especially about what I was seeing, the phenomenon of our time, it did not go over very well in the professional community. It took several years, but when it caught on big because everybody started getting into the amen corner, basically, other therapists from all disciplines, professional counselors, social workers, clinical social workers, nurse practitioners, psychiatric nurses, psychologists, psychiatrists, you name it, marriage and family counselors, anybody involved in the helping therapy professions. They all started kind of coming around and affirming what I had been saying. And that is that we live in a different age. And because we live in a different age, we have a different kind of problem that is surfacing as the dominant problem coming to the attention of mental health professionals. Mental health professionals used to concern themselves primarily with people's unconscious fears and insecurities, their emotional quote-unquote hang-ups, their neuroses, the things that were literally making them sick with worry, sick with anguish, sick with agony, emotional agony. These are the things that therapists traditionally dealt with people for. Therapy was never designed for, and therapists rarely had to deal with, problems related to a person's character, to what kind of person they were, to how ethical they were, to how caring they were, how selfish, how prideful. This was not the realm of therapy, but it has become so. It has become so. And that's what I started to say. I started to say that basically all the old notions about why people's lives were a mess were not so true anymore for the vast majority of folks. And as I say, early on, the reception to that kind of new and radical point of view wasn't as great as it is now. But it's much better now, and but still, some of these old notions persist. So I'm going to talk about this Gaslight article. It's a great article, by the way. I urge you all to go to DameMagazine.com and read Carrie's article on gaslighting. But this one expert in here, interviewed for the article, gives the standard party line. And I want to say, I want to quote accurately here. I'm looking at the article right now. Here's what one expert has to say, and I'm going to quote. Gaslighters are generally men and women who were narcissistically wounded early in life. In other words, they suffered a narcissistic trauma. They suffered a trauma to their self-image. And the trauma had to do with emotional abuse, psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, inconsistent parenting, and the like. So there you go. The person gaslighting you is gaslighting you because all these terrible things happen to them. They're suffering from that trauma. They haven't overcome it. And as wounded souls, this is the way they lash out. If they hadn't been wounded so badly, they hadn't been treated so badly, they would never do such a thing to you. And this, by the way, folks, buying into this notion has been the doing in. This has been the doing in of people in emotional relationships for years, for emotionally abusive relationships. And people who perpetuate these misconceptions, notice I did not say myths, because we misuse the term myth all the time to characterize a misconception or an incorrect assumption or a falsehood. A myth is not a falsehood. But this is a falsehood. What is a falsehood is that most people who abuse are wounded souls. Not so. I repeat, not so. Some people, yes, there are some people who abuse may in fact have been wounded souls. Some. But most, in our time, in our character-disturbed time, in our culture of entitlement and permissiveness and lack of character development, in our time, most nefarious characters are not wounded souls. They simply never developed. They're underdeveloped characters. They're arrested characters. They never learned because it was never reinforced. It may have even been taught, but it was never reinforced, not by our current culture. That's the important thing. Their parents may have taught them well, but when society at large does not reward or encourage the values that your parents and your church and your civic organizations and your other institutions try to instill in you, when the culture at large poo-poos those values and encourages other selfish, egomaniacal, heartless behaviors, and even rewards such behaviors, then you have people willing to abuse and exploit. And not because they're wounded, but because they're selfish. And because they're rewarded for it. We are innately savages. We have to be molded into people of good character. We are not naturally so. The old thinking was, we're naturally going to turn out great unless we're wounded. Not so. And it really bothers me, the professionals that still perpetuate these falsehoods. And yes, I use the term falsehoods. They're not myths. They're just flat out lies. Yes, there are some people who abuse and exploit who themselves may have been, to some degree, abused and exploited. And by the way, correlation is not causality. So we still don't have any proof, not a shred of it, that there is a causal link between the pain inflicted on somebody else and the pain they might inflict on somebody else. We don't really have good studies. We have plenty of correlational studies that show a correlation, but not that truly demonstrate the causality. So what I'm saying to you is that even though it may be true that some people abuse and exploit and were, in fact, emotionally wounded, doesn't mean that they abuse and exploit because they were abused in some way. It may just be that this proneness is on a gene that they carried from the abusive parent. That's possible. There are a number of possible explanations, none of which has been very well researched and documented. But my point about this, and the reason I stress this so much, is that I have seen literally hundreds of cases. I've witnessed firsthand hundreds of cases where people stayed in abusive relationships because they bought into these notions, because they saw their abuser as somehow suffering underneath it all, bought into the notion that somehow they must have been wounded in their early development, and therefore that wound is the cause of their behavior. They believed, and logically so, that with enough love and enough nursing to health, they could be salvaged. And that's what trapped them into that abusive relationship for years and years longer than necessary. And therapists who reinforce this notion, shame on you. Shame on you. Why perpetuate these things? Why perpetuate them? It does no good. And it can do harm. It can do immeasurable harm. Some of you may have had this very experience. Some of you may know very well what I'm talking about. Maybe you have an experience to share. Maybe you just want to ask a question. Maybe you disagree with me. I don't have any problem with folks taking issue with me. I'd like to hear your opinions one way or the other. So if you want to give me a call, if you have a question, or you want to challenge something I've had to say here, give me a call at 718-717-8296. That's 718-717-8296. Maybe you've had an experience with therapy. Maybe you've bought in at the therapist's recommendation to one of these standard party lines about why folks do the horrendous things they do. And maybe that kept you in a relationship far too long. If that's the case, give me a call as well. 718-717-8296. Happy to take your call. But at any rate, that was just one individual's take on why gaslighters, especially serial cheaters, engage in this kind of behavior. Why, when you are on to them, or why, when you suspect them, their tactic is to make you feel like you're out of your mind. And it really just, it perpetuates the abuse. So what this person says, once again, is that folks who do this, folks who gaslight, are generally men and women who were narcissistically wounded early in life through emotional abuse, physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, inconsistent parenting, and the like. Boy, if inconsistent parenting causes gaslighting, my children have no hope. I don't know a parent on the planet who hasn't been inconsistent in their parenting at some point. Just look at all these causal things that we that professionals say makes people behave badly. Folks, we are natural savages. We are. Socialization is a process, a 24-hour a day, 7-day a week, intensive process that occurs for many, many years and moments of our life. No creature on this planet outside of man, outside of humankind, no creature takes that long to shape into a socially responsible creature, capable of doing right by its fellow members of the species. It takes hour by hour, minute by minute, day by day, 7 days a week, every week of the year, for many years of constant training. And here's key words: not just the teaching, not just the modeling, but for anything to stick, for any learning to stick. This is elementary. Most of you have learned this in school at some point if you've taken any elementary psychology or sociology or anything like that. For anything to stick, for any learning to stick, it's like training a dog or an animal. You know, you've seen how animal trainers do this. For any learning to stick, there has to be reinforcement. Learning doesn't stay unless it's reinforced. You see these trainers at SeaWorld with these killer whales and with the other animals that they train, penguins or seals or any of the like. They have to get that food reward. And why do they give them that? Well, you know what would happen if they stopped? The animals would stop performing. The learning would be undone. In behavioral speak, we call this, the learning would be extinguished. It's not extinguished completely. Learning can't be completely undone. But at least the responding will be extinguished. When reinforcement is withheld, there has to be some reinforcement. And in a culture where we neither promote nor reward, and there's the key word, nor reward those aspects of good character development that we have prized through the ages, we might preach it. We might preach it from the rooftops. We might mention it every single Sunday in our churches. Our parents may preach it till they're blue in the face. They might even model it. If we're fortunate enough to have parents who practice what they preach, so they set the example, all well and good. But the learning's not going to stick unless it's reinforced. And in our culture, unfortunately, we not only don't encourage or reinforce the values and principles that would make us really great in character, but we sometimes punish those things, and we also reward and encourage alternative behaviors. Not so nice alternatives. And that's why we're in this crisis that we're in. And it's not just here. It's everywhere. But it's mostly in the industrialized free world. Because we're the ones that have had freedom. And unfortunately, like everything else, we have abused it. And that's why we have invited our loving government to try and help us out with rules and regulations that have become so oppressive to the already responsible among us that they've just literally sucked the joy out of living in a free society. Now, really conscientious people, I have to give them credit, because really conscientious people take these burdens on with so much love. They take the burden of responsibility on with so much love. They take the care of the planet seriously. They want to recycle. They want to obey all the rules they can. They observe all the caveats with respect to trying not to pollute. Really conscientious people take this all on, and they take it on with a certain amount of gladness. With no real resentment, they take it on freely because they're sincere in their desire to make a positive difference. So you got to hand it to them. But the yoke keeps getting more oppressive every day on those willing to pick up the burden. Whereas those of us who are willing to just do whatever it takes to get rich and mess with everybody else, or to abuse and exploit in relationships, father as many kids as possible, give birth to as many kids as possible, with no real thought about their welfare or how they'll contribute to society, and no sense of commitment to nurture and foster a relationship for the long term. Just abuse and exploit and move on. Abuse, exploit again, and move on. That's the pattern for some folks. And it's fostered by the values promoted in the dominant values promoted in the culture, a culture of entitlement and permissiveness. Especially the perhaps the most damage is done by our sense of entitlement. Because in that sense of entitlement, it works against a sense of obligation. And only when there's a sense of gratitude and obligation in place of a feeling of entitlement, only when folks recognize what a precious gift this life of ours is, what a precious resource we have in our planet, what a precious resource we have in each other, what a precious resource we might have in the person we once thought hung the moon and partnered up with. Only when we, in gratitude, appreciate what we've been given and honor that with a sense of obligation to do our part, to make things work, to give back, to make sure that we behave in a way that honors what we've been given. And if you're a person of faith, that honors the ultimate gift giver. Only when we do that do we have character. Only when we have character do we do great things and do great things together and build great societies, as we have done in the past. But it's all predicated on that. It's all predicated on that. So, I make the point, I really strayed here from the article. I make the point in this article that we need to get away from this notion We need to get away from this notion that people are just naturally good and they only do horrible things when they're wounded in some way, when they're suffering internally, emotionally, and that's why they lash out. Sometimes that's true. But most of the time, in this culture of entitlement and permissiveness, most of the time it's simply because they never learned better. In fact, they might have been given everything. As a matter of fact, sometimes the most despicable characters have everything in the way of benefits and privilege, and everything in the way of a benign rearing, not only devoid of abuse and neglect, but rich with opportunity and nurturing, and still, some people coming out of even those kinds of environments do horrible things. Why? Because they've learned that it works. And not only that, sometimes they've even been rewarded for it. If you teach somebody something, you encourage them to do something, and then you reward them for doing it, guess what? They'll do it again. Even if they were taught differently early on. If it's dominant enough, if there's enough messages out there actively promoted and reinforced, people learn. And then they say to themselves, yeah, I remember being taught this and that and the other thing. I remember my mom or my dad telling me this or that. But that's not how the world works. And so, da. And that's what we have. That's what we have, and that's why the problems we have. And we have just got to do a better job. Any of you in the listening audience that are professionals yourselves, if you're a member of the mental health community, and you're a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a professional counselor, nurse practitioner, social worker, clinical social worker, or a marriage and family therapist, please, I'm begging you, please quit promoting this universal talk that people who abuse and exploit must be wounded souls underneath, dealing with narcissistic wounds from early life that they haven't overcome, and that what they need is nurturing back to health. We see this dominant thinking in this industry, this unholy industry that has developed around so-called sex addiction. Now, I've talked about this before, but I'm not one of those who believes that there is absolutely no such thing. I have seen cases where a person's behavior pattern does truly mimic a genuine addiction, but those cases are very rare. They are very rare. They're not the majority of people that flood these treatment centers because of their bad behavior, because somebody's made them go. Most of the folks there are simply irresponsible characters who care nothing for anyone but themselves, who lack the capacity for empathy, and who are hedonistic. They're not looking for a relationship. They're looking for their next thrill. Next thing you know, there'll be a hedonist anonymous. Well, there probably is one. There probably is. And, frankly, because these 12-step programs are all at heart, when they work, really good character-building programs, when they're done right, perhaps it might even be a good thing. I don't know. But please, I'm begging you, therapists, do not give these messages to your clients who are victims of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. They will only prolong their own agony. They will only find reason not to see their abuser in the kind of light that would enable them to disavow themselves of any sense of guilt, place the blame where it really belongs, and take the necessary action to protect themselves. There's a term being coined now called therapy trauma, whereby the therapist actually induces trauma, therapy-induced trauma. And this is the case when therapists promote these old notions that abusive behavior is always the result of this kind of thing, emotional abuse and neglect. This is therapy-induced trauma for the real victim, so that the therapist becomes a co-traumatizer with the abuser. It's kind of co-abuse. Be careful, therapists. These old notions. Remember, therapists, we no longer think that emotionally cold mothers nursing their babies in a cold and heartless way cause autism. We no longer think that malarkey. Remember that? We no longer think that mothers who give their babies mixed messages with regard to loving them make them either schizophrenic or paranoid. We no longer think that, do we? And those notions were just as much tenets of the traditional beliefs about what makes people the way they are, that these other beliefs that we continue to spout, like only wounded souls gaslight or do these other nefarious behaviors. Most of the time, folks, it's spoiled, character deficient folks who have found that it works, who do these things. They abuse and exploit because they can and because it works. It's that simple. So I'm begging you folks, I'm begging you therapists out there, if we have any therapists listening, please quit spouting that stuff. It hurts people. You hurt people. I know of several cases where folks who have been the victim of serial cheaters and are hanging on for dear life, and their abuser is in one of these programs for the umpteenth time, and they're told year after year that your partner is still quote unquote in denial, end quote, and they're too quote unquote fragile right now to confront, and hang on, and don't place unreasonable demands on them just yet. Oh my gosh. This happens time and time again. I get letters from folks all the time dealing with this kind of thing. I don't know if you've had that kind of an experience. We have just really a few minutes, but I'll give the number again, 718-717-8296. If you have an example or something you want to share or just a question you want to ask, we have only a brief period of time, but once again, it's 718-717-8296 if you want to call in. But I can't say enough about how these erroneous old notions have hurt people. And so that's why in all of my work, in my books, in Sheep's Clothing, Character Disturbance, the Phenomenon of Our Age, and the Judas Syndrome, I present a different point of view. A point of view that will help reorient a person in a troubled relationship, see things as they really are, not as they have been taught many times that things are, by well-meaning but misguided professionals clinging to old notions about why people do the things they do. And just the shift in perspective, I am told by literally thousands, truly thousands of people have written me to say that very thing, that just the change of perspective was all they needed to end their misery and empower their lives. And that's very edifying for me, but it's also a powerful statement about how some of our tired and worn out and traditional, long-held perspectives and theories about why people do the things they do, how poorly they have served us in our modern times of entitlement and permissiveness. They really have no place anymore. And it's about time we relegated them to the ash heap of history. But, these old notions die hard. And so from time to time, I'm sure there'll be another article I'll be asked to contribute to, and I'll be one voice saying one thing, and I'm sure that 3 or 4 other experts will say something else. That's likely to continue for some time now. But more and more folks are realizing a different perspective. And I'll keep doing my best to promote that in my written works and on my blog articles. And I'll do my best to promote what I think is really what will ultimately save us as a country, help restore our greatness, and preserve our freedoms. And that is character. It's the foundation of a great society, a truly great society, not the great society label that that Lyndon Johnson had, that he was going to create overnight by just creating a social safety net so strong that nobody would slip through it. Because many, many years after that, we have the proof that alone isn't going to do it. It all comes down to character, folks. That's what it comes down to. It always has, and it always will, no matter how much we try to deny it. That's what really matters. And that's the message I'll be bringing to you each and every week and writing about on my blog posts. So visit manipulative-people.com, avail yourself of the article, and join me again next week for another edition of Character Matters. Good night.